And we're live. It is Wednesday, the 10th of September, the year of our Lord 2025. It is 8 o'clock a.m., and I want to say it is not every day of your life that a friend of yours gets freed from captivity by Khatib Hezbollah. And Elizabeth Tsurkov is not exactly a friend of mine because we've never met in person. We've just kind of corresponded on Twitter and on WhatsApp. But she is a friend of my wife's, and I have become a good friend of her family's while she has been in captivity. And so it isn't every day of your life that you are scheduled to have dinner with somebody's sister who is being held in captivity by Khatib Hezbollah. And then you walk out of the door of a meeting that you're going to, and there is a presidential tweet announcing that your dinner companion's sister has been freed. And you don't know whether to take it seriously. And you don't know, I mean, it is the president of the United States, but on the other hand, it's Donald Trump. And on the other hand, Elizabeth is not an American citizen. And so that is a complicating factor. And so, should you take it seriously when the president tweets that she's been freed and you're supposed to have dinner with not one, but two of her sisters? And so you uh, and of course, the least important thing on either of the sisters' agenda will be trying to figure out whether your dinner is still on. And so you go to the dinner that you're supposed to meet them at, and of course, they don't show up, presumably because they're already on a plane to whether it's Ramstein Air Base or U.S. Embassy Baghdad or home to Israel. You're not really sure, but you have a celebratory dinner all by yourself, and then later on with your wife when she shows up, because Elizabeth Tsurkov, uh, Princeton graduate student, uh, fascinating scholar of Syria and Iraq, captured 2.5 years ago on the streets of Baghdad by a crazed, deranged Iranian proxy militia, and held under apparently, I guess we'll find out how unspeakable the conditions were soon enough. For 2.5 years, is finally free. In celebration of which, I put on this morning my most garish dog shirt, which Catherine Pompilio says is the most horrifyingly ugly dog shirt I own. And I want to say to Catherine that you don't get to yell at me about my dog shirt choices on days that friends of my family have been freed by Khatib Hezbollah. It's just a dog shirt, free day. I get to do whatever I want, K-Pomps. So we're going to be joined shortly by Anna Bauer, who has an important story to talk to us about um, in lawfare. But in the meantime, I just want to say that, every now and then, in the darkest of bleak times, the good guys still win one every now and then. And, you know, uh, um, Elizabeth should never have been kidnapped, of course. She shouldn't have been held for 2.5 years under whatever conditions. And getting her freed was a real project on the part of a bunch of people, particularly her sister Emma, who has really thought about very little else for the last 2.5 years and has been uh, just a unbelievable force of energy and creativity and strategic thought and action. And so want to say a big shout out to that whole family, which has been through absolute hell, and a reminder that, every other hostage family, American, Israeli, and other Ukrainian. There are, we call them prisoners of war when they're Ukrainian, but they're actually hostages. Uh, has gone through, is going through something similar. And so let Elizabeth stand in your mind um, for everybody uh, who's being held under highly coercive, abusive conditions by evil governments somewhere. Um, all of which is a particularly cheerful way of saying that the sun is not shining in Washington, D.C., but the birds are chirping. And I think today is going to be a great freaking day. And I am sure that at least two of the cactuses agree with me.
We're watching Dog Shirt TV, a forking revolution in morning television.
You are watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is a forking revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features is that occasionally I put on my most garish dog shirt, specifically in order to annoy Catherine Pompilio because I'm feeling chipper this morning. And another one of the revolutionary features is that Holly Berkeley Fletcher shows up despite intense back pain today. And you can see on her face that it is a struggle for her to be here, but she is here for you, people. All 32 of you should be expressing gratitude to Holly in the chat because, like a hostage of Khatib Hezbollah, she is uh, here anyway. That's a really
Bit of a hostage. I mean,
you are a bit of
not to make light of the situation. And another revolution is that sometimes when Holly attempts to coordinate the two cactuses, one of the cactuses says the intro and the other cactus sings happy birthday instead.
that's right. And when that happens, it is a harbinger of a great day. All of which is an 8-minute long way of saying that we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But every now and then, the good guys still win one. Um, Holly, uh, oh, and yet another one of the revolutionary features is that Anna Bauer is, of course, running late. Um,
Which is totally normal.
yeah, well, it's revolutionary for other shows, but totes normal for Dog Shirt TV. Holly,
Yeah, I'm so happy about your friend, and I'm also, my PhD research, the only way I could have been held hostage while researching my PhD is if, um, you know, like Frederick Douglass, like the ghost of Frederick Douglass, like came out of the archive that I was reading and drug me off into the afterlife,
well,
which did not happen. So,
one of the heartwarming things about Elizabeth's release yesterday, which happened on Blue Sky, is how many Palestinian and um, Syrian and Lebanese and Egyptian people I saw posting uh, their relief about it. Elizabeth is Israeli, and she actually comes from she grew up in a right wing settlement, but uh, she is not part of that world at all. She is you know, an advocate for, she's done all kinds of work on behalf of human rights in the region. Including Palestinians, she's been very outspoken on a whole lot of matters, and it is actually lovely to see people, recognize that in a way that is not colored by the fact that she's, she's Israeli, and and people are, responding to her as an individual, and that's a pretty neat thing. Um,
Go on Trump's Nobel Peace Prize application as a bullet point.
Well, I want to say this about Donald Trump on this, because as you know, Holly, I am the last person who usually tolerates people say you got to give it to Trump on this.
Last person. I would say you're actually high up in the list who is willing to give him credit when it's maybe due.
So, Trump, I don't know what role, if any, Trump played in this. I know he announced it and took credit for it,
You will, of
which
course, you will take credit.
could mean he played no role whatsoever. I will say that Adam Boehlert, his hostage negotiator, has taken an interest in this case from the time they came into office. Trump has um, gotten a bunch of hostages released. The Biden administration did as well, but Trump does seem to care about U.S. hostages, and he has, including in some ways that, you know, with respect to the Hamas hostages, he's kind of intervened for U.S. nationals, dual nationals, and bumped them to the front of the line, which has actually pissed off some Israelis. Um, he does seem to care about getting U.S. hostages home. Now, the wrinkle, of course, is that Elizabeth is not a U.S. citizen. She's an Israeli national.
But
Um,
she was a foreign student, which I didn't know they liked those anymore. So that's
Correct.
interesting.
She was a U.S. based American at an American university at Princeton, doing dissertation research. So what Elizabeth's like what his role was here, I don't know, and I don't actually want to be dismissive of it preemptively, because I do think Adam Buller cared about this case a lot, and to the extent that the administration puts an emphasis on hostage repatriation, including those who are not, strictly speaking, American. um, I don't really I don't want to discourage that. And so I will be the first to make fun of Trump's role if it turns out to be mythical. I do note that Emma yesterday tweeted her thanks to Trump and to Bullard. And so look, if they I will be happy to give them credit if credit is warranted. I still don't feel like I have the remotest sense of why this happened yesterday or how it happened. And I do note that as of 2:07 p.m., when I made my dinner arrangements for Emma and their other sister, Emma didn't seem to have any sense that this was Freedom Day. She was, we made an arrangement at 2:07, and then at 5 o'clock or thereabouts, Trump made this announcement. And I, I don't know, it came out of nowhere to me, and I think it probably came out of nowhere to the family too.
Hmm.
So, we will see how Trump uh, um, uh, what the role was. So, folks, I scheduled Anna Bauer to come on this show last night before I knew that Russia was going to blow up NATO today. Um,
We
so,
can talk about NATO if you want. I don't know anything about it though. I literally
well,
have
yeah,
no
it doesn't seem to be it
because
doesn't seem to play to your particular strengths. So we're going to stick with the program today, and we will talk about blowing up NATO tomorrow, by which time we will know something about Poland's reaction as well as the United States' reaction, because you will recall, I think, that on this very show, uh, Nastya and Minna Olander and I had conversations about what the mechanism by which Putin would try to explore blowing up NATO. And one of the four scenarios that we talked about was more drones into Poland, with a kind of oops.
I
Um,
was there too. I remember. I remember.
yeah, were you there?
I
I
was
don't.
there.
Yeah,
I had
cool.
nothing to add, I'm sure, but I was there.
So we talked
I
about
was there. It was rare. I remember it all too well.
Lithuania scenario.
Swift quote, Ben.
I
Just
knew that. I knew that because of the gleam in her eye. We talked about an Estonia situation. We talked about a Finnish situation, and we talked about Polish airspace. And that one is clearly you send 19 drones into Poland on purpose and then deny that you did it. And that is a test of whether NATO still means anything. And we're going to find out the answer to that today. So, buy your popcorn, and it's not every day that you get to watch and see whether a grand 80-year-old alliance falls apart or not. Um, but
These days,
today we are talking about Judge Sparkle Suknanan, which, you can't make this shit up. Best name on the
she's
federal
got to
bench.
be a Swiftie, don't you think, Anna?
yeah, and I also think that Ben, part of the reason he wanted me to come on this show is just so he can say the name Sparkle Suknanon over and over again.
Uh, duh. Yeah.
We already did a Lawfare podcast on this topic, but not the piece that I wrote like a week ago. And Ben, I could just see in his face, was so delighted to be
I
able to say it
look,
over and over and over
It's
again.
delightful.
being
It's just
It's
objectively
great.
delightful.
being a podcast host has a number of cool perks. One is that, every now and then somebody just recognizes your voice walking down the street, which happened to me the other day when I was standing with Holly at the protest and somebody recognized my voice, a guy named Norman. And But one of them is that every now and then a judge with an awesome name does a cool thing, and you get to talk about the cool thing and then say the name. And let's just face it, there are 900 people on the federal bench, none of whom has a cooler name than Sparkle Suknanan. So, one of the people, by the way, whose name is less cool than Sparkle Suknanan is James Boasberg, who has a perfectly fine name, but it's not Sparkle Suknanan.
Boasberg is fun to say
I
though.
know, but James, boring,
James is pretty boring, yeah.
right? It's kind of. Now, speaking of names, sometimes the algorithm and Apple play tricks on me. And one of the things that you should know about Anna Bauer's name is that her middle name is Marie. And I know this because um, uh, when she calls me, her name shows up as Anna Marie Bauer. And the other day, for no reason whatsoever, Apple decided to insert a second Marie into Anna Marie Bauer. And so whether she knows it or not, she has changed her name to Anna Marie Bauer, which we may, just for the sake of playing with names today, refer to her as for the rest of the show. So, Anna Marie Bauer, talk to us about, describe the premise of the story that you wrote for Lawfare about Jim Boasberg and Sparkle Suknanon.
Yeah, it's a tale of two judges who both were faced with very similar circumstances on a weekend called an emergency hearing over the summary removal of migrants from the United States in circumstances in which there's not a whole lot of legal basis and basically no due process whatsoever. And they had different outcomes, though. 6 months apart, very similar circumstances, but different outcomes. So the point of the story is to both tell the story of this recent case that Judge Sparkle Suknanon handled over Labor Day weekend, because it's not really getting as much attention as I think it should. But then also tell the story of how these two cases between Boasberg and Suknanon turned out differently 6 months apart and why.
All right. So, first of all, Andrew poses this theory in the chat. It's because Emile Bovy wasn't around to tell his underlings to tell the courts to fuck off. And there's some truth to this. Emile Bovy was an amplifier of the story, but I actually think Andrew is wrong here, that the Boasberg story was a giant matter from the moment it started, and the Suknanon case was not. And I guess my question is, why do you think that's true? Emile Bovy could be part of the answer, but I don't think he's the whole answer. It was a big deal before his involvement became clear.
Wait, sorry, the question is, why is it that the Suknanon story was a big deal?
Wasn't a big deal. It just, I mean, it happened. There was passing coverage of it, but it wasn't the same magnitude of an earthquake that the Boasberg thing was back in March. Is it just because it's a second time? Is it because there's no Sukkot? Is it because the Family Reunification and the Alien Enemies Act just have a different power? Is it because we've done it once before? What's the explanation for the fact that people didn't really seem to give a shit this time?
You know, I've actually wondered this myself, Ben. I don't know. I mean, maybe also part of it is that like the Boasberg thing, it was a weekend, but it wasn't Labor Day weekend. And like, I mean, I ended up, but like, luckily I had basically no plans for Labor Day. So I ended up spending like all day and all night on Sunday when this started developing, like paying attention to it and then covering it. I think there was like maybe only like one other legal journalist who covered it that I'm aware of, at least. Like, there were definitely other people who were the breaking news reporters who were put on it, but I'm talking about like your dedicated legal journalist. There wasn't the normal amount of coverage that I think there usually would be had this happen. Yeah, Kyle Cheney was all over it, and I think Josh Gerstein also assisted with Politico's efforts for coverage there. They're always on top of things, but like there were even some legal reporters who afterward, because they had plans, they were like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for covering this," because like we totally, couldn't do it. So I think that's part of it. And also there's just the fact that like the Boasberg thing, it was like the Alien Enemies Act. I think that had been a big thing people were preparing for, that people thought that was like a very big legal story that seemed to be at the start of the Trump administration, one of the signals that Trump was going to try to use these emergency powers in a way that, did not comport with reality. And I think that that's an element, whereas this is just, it's not an emergency power, although it is an equally dubious legal argument. So yeah, I don't know. That's a few of my thoughts on why maybe. What do you think, Ben? Like, I'm
I,
curious. We haven't
I
talked
think
about this.
I think the big explanation is that in one case, the judge was successful in preventing it, and in the other case, he was not.
Oh, right.
And
Well, yeah, of
and
course.
that
There's that
the
too.
huge the giant story of the Boasberg situation arose because there was a compliance question. And and if you manage the compliance question and you get compliance, it immediately becomes a dog bites man story. And, you know, Trump administration eager to deport kids stopped by court is just a lesser story than Trump administration defies court order, deports 260 American alleged alien enemies. And I think it is precisely her success that makes the story less compelling.
Yeah, but I thought you were okay. But your framing of the question before, I thought was like, before we got to the stopping of it all, like, why is it that these two stories were, because I think it's true too that before we even got to the stopping of it, like the Boasberg matter was, it was like everyone was watching that. Whereas here, it felt like it still didn't have the same type of interest, before you ever even get to the compliance issues.
That
But
may be right, but I do think the Boasberg story really blew up when they defied the order.
yeah, and I think that's obviously right. Like a judicial defiance, or executive branch defying judicial orders is obviously going to be more of a story than deportation stopped.
All right, so your story, and I don't want you to walk us through the whole thing because it is two narratives that a lot of people, kind of already know the parameters of. But your story identifies a number of areas where Judge Suknanan really appears to have been aware of what happened 6 months ago and behaved differently from Judge Boasberg. So I don't want to throw any shade at Judge Boasberg because it's not, I don't think anything he did was unreasonable or reflected undue, uh, well, in retrospective, obviously it reflected undue faith in Drew Ensign and the Justice Department and the compliance of the government. But I'm not sure that was unreasonable. In fact, I'm quite confident it was reasonable for him to expect at the time. Um, what are the key points at which she behaves differently from him in order to ultimately get this quite different outcome?
Well, let me start by saying there are a lot of ways in which they behaved in a very similar way. Like, Boasberg, the case is filed, and in both instances, I think at a very similar time. I think both the ACLU and the NILC lawyers, ACLU being the attorneys who represented individuals in the JGG case before Boasberg, and then the NILC lawyers being the ones who represented the children in LGML. I think they both filed the complaints around 1 a.m. Boasberg did not. As I understand it, I think he actually wasn't the emergency duty judge. Am I correct? But he had been assigned it before emergency, before the weekend in some way. John will correct me, I'm sure. Yes, thank you. But there's a difference here in that we had an emergency duty judge with Suknanon in one case, and then Boasberg was actually assigned the case. So he wakes up, the morning after it's filed, like a few hours after it's filed, around 8 a.m. He has information just like Suknanon that there's these potentially imminent flights that are going to depart that day. He ends up going ahead and enjoining on the basis that there is no proclamation that's published invoking the Alien Enemies Act. He goes ahead and says, okay, I'm enjoining these like 5 named plaintiffs from being removed from the United States. Similarly, Suknanon, emergency duty judge, she does wake up earlier. She wakes up, around 2:30 because she's on call as the emergency duty judge. She has this motion for a TRO to stop the removal of these unaccompanied children. Not hearing from the government, like Boasberg, she enters a TRO as to the 10 named plaintiffs around 4 a.m. So in both cases, they try to reach out to the government, didn't get a response, and then, went ahead and entered a TRO just to the people who were actually named in the case. And then both of them also having getting more information throughout the day that that there was going to be these flights, ended up moving a hearing that had been set to talk about class certification, that kind of thing. Both of them moved it up to an earlier time. So those are the same things. The difference is, though, is that in Boasberg's case, he didn't go ahead and provisionally certify the class before the hearing, even after he, had information that these flights are going to go ahead and take off. He had a hearing. It lasted, about an hour, a little more than an hour. And at one point, he even, gives Drew Ensign a chance to go off and talk to his client and see what's going on with the planes. Meanwhile, the planes are literally taking off, and they're, at that point, there's a whole thing with like the oral order having been given, and then when the written order came from Boasberg, all of that we can go into. But the point is just that because Boasberg waited, there was this gap in which the government, could kind of make its argument that it ultimately did about why they didn't have to follow the oral order and all of that. In Suknanon's case, though, she gets information the planes are taking off, and as soon as the hearing is starting at 12:37, actually, she goes ahead and just
hearing.
Huh?
She moved up.
Yeah. I already said that she moved up. A hearing that had been set, but
she moves up the hearing, and the very first thing she does is she makes sure those planes are on the ground.
Right, she makes sure, and the very first thing she does is she issues a written order to provisionally certify the class, such that everyone will be, stopped from being removed, all of the children, not just the named plaintiffs. And then the first thing she does, she didn't even... There was just no preliminary discussion whatsoever. She just got in there and she was like, Mr. Ensign, I want you... I don't know what we landed on, Ensign or Ensign, but Ensign, I want you to go away and find out if the planes are on the ground and go, tell everyone who needs to know. And at that point, she'd already emailed Brian Hudak, who's the head of the civil division, to let him know, like, here's my order, make sure that it's distributed to everyone at the Justice Department.
And she called him at home.
Yeah, she called him at home in the middle of the night, the night before, and she called the head of the criminal division as well. So she was being very proactive.
I have a question about the lawyering here, which is something we don't often see publicly exposed, and so I'm not sure what we know. But it strikes me that the plaintiffs the LGML plaintiffs invoked whatever they needed to do to call a judge at 2 a.m. in the morning, which I think means you call the number that the DC District Court has published for their security desk, and then they call a judge. And it seems like the JGG plaintiffs didn't do that. Maybe they did, and maybe it didn't get to Boasberg in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., but it strikes me as significant that, and perhaps outcome determinative, that the plaintiffs successfully got a judge to look at it in the middle of the night.
So my recollection is that the Boasberg situation arose later, which is to say early in the morning. It was like a 6 a.m. situation or a but not like a 1 a.m. situation. Am I misremembering that, Anne?
So I think they filed the complaint at like 1 a.m., the ACLU, but I think it wasn't until a few hours later, maybe, that they filed the motion for a TRO, but I would have to check. I also think, and again, this is something that I was wondering if John knew, because he knows these types of things, or tends to remember them, is I don't remember the exact circumstances of case assignment, because typically on a weekend, if you had a case that's filed at 1 a.m. on the Saturday night and then a motion for a TRO that comes later, it wouldn't have been assigned to a judge yet. It would go to an emergency duty judge, right? I think that,
So I think
and
the emergency duty judges only exist on weekends. At least
yeah,
that.
this was a weekend though.
Oh, that's sorry. Yep.
Yeah. So what I think might have happened though, because remember there was news that the proclamation was coming, and I was looking at the DC local rules, and a part of it is like if you know you're going to file before the weekend, you can tell the clerk, and they might go ahead and figure out the case assignments for the weekend. Do you see what I'm saying? And so it might have been a situation like that, but I'd have to look back at it where like there was something different where Boasberg stayed on the case, where Suknanon was just temporary and she was on the emergency duty line, like whereas I think Boasberg was, outside of that track because he'd been assigned to the case already.
So there is another big difference between the way they handled these, and I can't imagine it was not conscious on her part, which is, you know, because the planes leave the tarmac and leave US airspace, he becomes consumed with the question of whether he can, order them turned around. And then there's the defiance question and the transfer of custody. Whereas she gets them, they're grounded. She gets confirmation that they're grounded, and whether one of them took off or and was turned around or whether it never took off is apparently a question in dispute. But then she has this series of status reports filed over the course of basically the rest of the weekend that are like individual kids being removed from the planes. Uh, and she kind of stuck with it in a way that, if you look at the timestamps on these, she was not sleeping a lot. Um, so talk a little bit about the follow up here.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it was really remarkable. Remember, Judge Suknanon woke up at 2:30 in the morning, also woke her clerks up, she said, then tries to go wake up the head of the civil division and the head of the criminal division at DOJ, is unsuccessful. So she's coming into this hearing not very happy that A, she's been up since 2:30 in the morning, but also she at first had a lot of trouble getting in contact with DOJ. And then once DOJ gets there, they claim that it's outrageous for her to, or it's outrageous that the plaintiffs want a TRO to stop this reunification from happening. And so she, gives a long monologue in which she is kind of like, the reason we're here is because the government decided in the wee hours of the morning with little notice, and like when I say little notice, I mean the shelter programs where these kids live got these emails saying they needed to be ready to be discharged at like 11:45 p.m. Eastern time. Like, the government didn't even send out actual notices to the official legal service provider, Acacia Center for Justice, until 1:12 a.m. So I mean, there was no real notice here. These kids were already being prepared to be put on a plane. All of this has Judge Suknanon when we finally get into the hearing, and she's asking whether the kids have been deplaned and finds out that they haven't been. You know, she's not thrilled about that because she doesn't understand why, you know, she's issued this order and then, you know, you get 30 minutes into the hearing and the kids still have not started to be deplaned. She tells Ensign that she wants a status report from him. Then we leave the hearing, and at this point, Drew Ensign has not filed a notice of appearance, so he's not receiving docket notifications, although frankly, I have a hard time believing that these people aren't paying attention to the news and reporting on the case and following it, and eventually don't see what happens next, which is that Judge Suknanon, as soon as we get out of the hearing, puts an order on the docket requiring the government by 4 p.m. to inform her if the kids have been deplaned and returned to ORR custody. The government blows that deadline because Drew Ensign, as he later tells the judge, didn't get the docket notification. He didn't know he had a status report due. And meanwhile, the government is very slowly taking these kids off of planes and starting the process of transporting them back to their shelter programs. A lot of the kids who, you know, had been there since like 5 a.m. didn't leave the airport until 6:30 or 7:30 p.m. at night. Even though Judge Suknanon issued her order to certify the class and prohibit their removal at like 12:30 p.m. And so she just decides that she's going to micromanage the Justice Department to make sure that this happens.
So
And
I have a comment on that, which is to say, not only was she heading in that direction from the hearing, but the fact that DOJ blew their deadline, regardless of why, I think could only have encouraged her to say, yes, these people need to be on an even tighter leash than the tight leash that I bought for them.
exactly. And I think that made her realize that, you know, and also I think it speaks to the vulnerable like population that this order relates to. Like you're talking about kids who had been pulled out of their beds at the shelter program that they'd been living in. Like these are like this is like why there are certain legal protections for these kids because they're an incredibly vulnerable population. And I think she wanted to see to it that every single one of them like got back in their bed that night and you know they were appropriately returned to the custody of HHS, which is responsible for their care and custody. So throughout the day we had 4 different status reports. The last one was like around midnight or 11 p.m. So the judge at that point had been up since 2:30 a.m. The government finally on Monday, a little before noon, the last 2 remaining kids, or maybe, yeah, I think that was it, 2. There were like 2 the night before who had not been returned because some of these kids were coming from different states and stuff. So finally, the government said that everyone had been returned to ORR custody or the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But yeah, that was really remarkable. The other thing I'll mention too that she did is, you know, it was very clear to me that she did not feel that she could take Drew Ensign's representations in good faith. He represented that the all of the children who were being put on the planes were children whose parents had requested their return to Guatemala. And Judge Suknanon was from the get-go, like, very skeptical of that claim. There were declarations in the case that already seemed to contradict it. But, you know, she, like, twice made sure to get him on record, like, to fully, you know, clarify the facts and what the Justice Department was representing to that end. So she said, like, 2 times, Mr. Ensign, are you representing to the court that all of these children have parents who have requested their return? And he eventually, you know, qualified it a little bit by saying, that's what I've been told.
That's what I've been told.
But it subsequently is that the Justice Department has dropped that completely because it's very clearly was not true. The plaintiffs introduced a number of declarations as well to the effect that it was not true. John, yeah.
So I mean, just to emphasize that point, you know, the one thing I posted live from this hearing was at 1:13 on that Sunday, where Suknanen asked, "Is it your representation that?" And Ensign responded, "Your Honor, my understanding is that." And you know, she wasn't explicit in saying, "Oh well, your understanding is not a representation," but given the way the hearing went, that's how I took it. It's certainly how I would have taken it if I were in her shoes.
Right, and it was important that she did that, I think, because in the beginning, he just flat out, he never said in the beginning, you know, based on information and belief or based on my understanding, he just said, Your Honor, all of these kids are, like, he made a very unqualified statement about it, and I think she didn't want him to be able to kind of, like, she wanted to know, like, what's the basis of this claim. And it clearly became clear, or it then became clear that, you know, he was making that representation just based on what he said was what he'd been told, or based on his understanding. And I think that led her to have even less confidence that that he was being, you know, fully forthcoming, or that what the Justice Department was telling her was true.
But
All right, before we move on, and I want to move on to the third judge in this story, who has not yet made his appearance, but is about to, I believe, today. John, you had another point you wanted to make.
Well, I just want to offer on the other side of the ledger 2 things. One is that going into the noon advanced hearing, there was a TRO in place only for the 10 named plaintiffs. Yet, the government allegedly turned around a flight, maybe one of the named plaintiffs was on it, and Drew Ensign was there to say that nobody was being removed from the country. And that seemed like a concession that the government didn't have to make. Maybe it was strategically quite wise, but it struck me as a different kind of strategic response than we'd seen in the past. Well, in the JGG case, for instance. And also, I guess we should, I don't want to give a lot of credit to Drew Ensign, but I do think he was probably not fully informed about what was going on at that hearing. He certainly appeared not to be.
He this is one of the differences I think is important to point out, is, like, I've seen Drew Ensign represent the Justice Department in across all of these controversial cases, Abrego Garcia, JGG, all, like, whatever. And I will say that even though I truly don't believe really a word that Drew Ensign says, in this case, it was very clear to me he was not prepared like he usually is. He, for example, in the JGG case, you know, he came in with really detailed legal arguments. It was clear he had advance notice that this was going to happen so they could prepare their legal arguments, because he was going in there, you know, guns blazing with, like, all the case sites that he needed. He was, like, could talk very eloquently about like how the Alien Enemies Act relief sounds in habeas and all of this stuff. He'd clearly thought about it. He was prepared for it. In this case, He came into this 12:30 p.m. TRO hearing and he was making like really inaccurate statements about even the law that I thought was really unusual. Like he claimed that the provision that they were citing, which is about ORR's authority, which is under the Health and Human Services Department, he claimed that gives the Department of Homeland Security authority, and he just didn't really seem to like have a grasp of the statutory provisions they were relying on. And he also told the judge he was new to the case. I actually do in this instance think that he just truly was not very well informed about things.
Right. Well, he probably didn't have a lot of time to be.
Yeah.
Also, there's plausible deniability or structural reasons to gain that.
Yeah.
Right, but what my point though, Ben, is that he also presumably or in the Alien Enemies Act case, he shouldn't have had a whole lot of time to be right.
Well,
But it's
except that the Alien Enemies Act proclamation will have been presumably at least minimally vetted by the Justice Department, so you could anticipate some of the actions that would happen in response to it. Whereas here, it's possible that, you know, this scheme was concocted entirely between it doesn't involve a proclamation, right? It doesn't involve something that there would be any Justice Department review of necessarily in the front end. And so some combination of DHS and HHS concoct this scheme with Stephen Miller, and maybe the first time the Justice Department learns about it is in the middle of the night when somebody files suit.
I mean, I would be very surprised if that's the case, but yeah, I think that is entirely possible in this particular case. Yeah.
Imagine a world where the White House decides that Drew Ensign needs to be kept out of the loop in order for them to effect their actions. That is
Right, that it's better if he's not able to make accurate factual
that is a
representation.
crazy world.
Right. And look, there's I mean, I don't know that this is the reason, but we have seen over and over again where this Justice Department sends in brand new attorneys in like entirely unrelated divisions. I'm thinking in particularly that guy in the Brego Garcia case. What was his name? Kojasta, who
Oh
was
yeah,
like
whatever happened to that guy?
yeah, whatever happened to that guy who's like from the like consumer protection division of DOJ or something to go do the Abrego Garcia case because he clearly didn't know anything. And they've done this over and over again where they throw new attorneys in, they don't know anything, so they can't represent anything to the judge.
Right, exactly right. All right, we are going to run out of time soon, so let's talk about the third judge in this story who is slated to make his appearance today, and his name is Tim Kelly.
His name is Tim Kelly. He's a Trump appointee. As I said previously, Judge Sukdanon was the emergency duty judge, so her tenure on this case ended with her assignment as the emergency duty judge. She had set a briefing schedule and a hearing, but then come Tuesday after Labor Day weekend, Judge Kelly is assigned to the case through the random assignment process. And it changes a few things around with the briefing schedule. We've had briefing now, and at 2 p.m. today, Judge Kelly is set to hear argument on the motion for a preliminary injunction. I am going to try to cover it, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to because Judge Kelly is one of the judges who doesn't provide public access as in the regular course of his cases. There
But
is
Roger will be there,
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was about to say. Is Roger plans to be there in person, so one of us will be covering it, or both of us, hopefully. But yeah, so we'll see. I mean, to me, this is the kind of like legal argument that is so baseless that I think there's a tendency for people to say, "Oh, he's a Trump judge. He is going to."
Tim
Um,
Kelly is a straight shooter. I watched at a distance his handling of the Proud Boys case, and I thought it was exemplary. And I, you know, he's exactly the sort of judge that, in principle, I am anxious about, which is to say, somebody who came to the bench from being a congressional staffer. But there are two of those judges on, well, there's three, but the third I'm really not a fan of, which is Richard Leon. But the two that are, but Kelly and Beryl Howell have both been excellent judges, um, and I would not assume that the fact that Kelly was appointed by Trump has any bearing on this at all.
yeah, that's where I was going with this, is that I think that even though there's a tendency for people to assume that a Trump appointee is going to, you know, do whatever Trump wants, not all Trump appointees are the same. Not all Trump appointees are Eileen Cannon, and even Eileen Cannon often or occasionally denied motions from Trump. But in this case, you know, the legal argument that they're making is to me just crazy. It's so like it is so baseless that I don't think that any serious judge who looked at it would be able to find a way to say, you know, yeah, I am going to rule in favor of the government here. Ben, is that your impression just based on reading what I've written about it, or, you know?
Yeah, so I have not dove deep in this legal issue at all, and so I would not hold my instincts out as probative of anything. That said, they are consistent with yours. The government's position seems to be here that it's not engaged in um, any removals or deportations. Rather, it's engaged in family reunifications at the request of families, and it doesn't have, and there's no, and of the Guatemalan government, and there are no impediments to its all of immigration law in its ability to do that. And I don't know of any precedent for that idea, and I don't see any reason to imagine that like this issue never would have come up before. And so my assumption is that it's um, laughable horseshit. But lots of things that I think are laughable horseshit turn out to be good law, except at least on an interim basis, by the five justices of the Supreme Court. So I don't
To
I
be
don't want to
fair,
represent my instincts about this as probative of anything. I do think that, you know, Tim Kelly does not live on a different moral planet than I do. Um, and um, I can't imagine, let's put it this way, I can't imagine this hearing is going to go well for Drew Ensign.
yeah, so I think that, to be clear, I am making no representations about what the Supreme Court would do on anything, because I never assume with the Supreme Court that I have any idea what they're thinking. But I mean Tim Kelly, as with respect to this motion for a preliminary injunction, I don't see how any reasonable, serious judge looks at this and says, "Oh yeah, this is fine." And I don't mean that. I do mean that in a moral sense, but I also very much mean it in a legal sense.
We are going to leave it there. Anna Marie Bauer, as your Chiron now accurately reflects. It is great to see you. And folks, we're going to be back tomorrow. I don't know who we're going to be with, but we're going to be talking about Poland and the end of NATO. And we'll by then we will know whether NATO has ended. Folks, keep the faith. Pray with a raised fist and all that jazz, and stand in solidarity with the people of Poland.